The thing people don't understand about Thanksgiving dinners is that the loudest moments aren't the ones where someone raises their voice. The real damage happens when everything goes quiet at once. When forks stop moving. When someone says a sentence they've clearly been rehearsing for years and finally decides the gravy is thick enough to hide it in. That night, my mother set her fork down with care. Not a clatter, not a sigh, just a soft, deliberate touch against the plate, like she was underlining something invisible. She looked straight at me and said, "You owe this family, after everything we sacrificed for you." No anger, no trembling, just certainty, the kind that assumes the room already agrees. I didn't answer. I kept my hands where they were, folded in my lap, fingers pressed together the way you do when you're making sure you don't reach for something sharp. Around us, the table was still dressed up for its own performance. Candles burning low, napkins folded too neatly, a turkey that had cost more than my first car, sitting there like a centerpiece no one wanted to admit they couldn't afford. I'd paid for all of it, of course. $1,680. I remembered the number because the receipt had made me pause. It always does when a grocery bill looks like rent. My uncle stared at his plate. My cousin suddenly found something fascinating about her wine glass. No one challenged her. They rarely do when she uses that tone. It's the tone that sounds like love if you grew up inside it long enough. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew better than to hand her what she was reaching for. She wanted a reaction, an argument, proof that I was still playing the same old role, the difficult one, the ungrateful one. Silence, in that house, has always been more disruptive than shouting. I slipped my phone out of my pocket under the table, just enough to see the lock screen glow. There it was. A small calendar reminder, unassuming, sitting there like a private joke. Just a date, no label, no explanation. I checked it the way someone checks the weather before a long drive. Briefly, calmly, enough to confirm what I already knew. Then I put the phone away. My mother waited. The room waited with her. Seconds stretched thin, like overcooked green beans. Finally, she cleared her throat, ready to continue the speech she'd prepared. That's when I looked up, met her eyes, and gave her a small smile. The kind you give when you've already left a conversation, even if your chair is still at the table. I didn't say a word, and for the first time all evening, that seemed to bother her more than anything I could have said. I learned a long time ago that silence didn't start that night. It had been trained into me, slowly, like posture. You don't notice it happening until one day you realize you're standing a little behind everyone else, and no one remembers asking you to step back. In our family, there were roles. They weren't written down anywhere, but everyone knew them. My brother Ethan was the son everything revolved around. Bright, needy, constantly on the verge of something. Success or collapse, depending on who was telling the story that week. I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who'd be fine. That phrase followed me like a coat I never took off. When Ethan ran short on tuition his sophomore year, my mother called me late one evening. I remember standing in my kitchen in Cleveland, one sock on, one sock off, listening to her explain the situation as if it were weather. Unavoidable, regrettable, temporary. She didn't ask if I could help. She told me they needed time, and that my own plans would have to wait. I said okay. I always did. It seemed easier than explaining why I shouldn't have to. A year later, I earned a scholarship. A good one. Full ride, the kind people clap for at banquets. I called home with the letter still open on the table, the edges curling from how many times I'd unfolded it just to make sure it was real. My mother paused, then said, "That's nice, Laura, but your brother is really struggling right now." The word nice landed where congratulations should have been. like a placeholder someone forgot to replace. It wasn't cruelty. That's the funny part. No one was yelling, no doors slammed, there were no dramatic punishments or locked bedrooms, just a constant, gentle rearranging of priorities where I always ended up last. Not unimportant, just adjustable. Ethan needed help with rent. Ethan needed time to figure things out. Ethan needed understanding. I needed patience. I needed perspective. I needed to remember that family came first, which always seemed to mean him. By my late 20s, I'd stopped bringing things up altogether. Promotions, raises, the quiet milestones that come from paying your own way and not needing a bailout. They didn't fit the narrative. I could feel it whenever I spoke, how the room subtly shifted, how my news created inconvenience instead of pride. So I learned to edit myself, learned to keep my wins small and my voice even. When people ask what it was like growing up in my family, I tell them it wasn't bad, and that's true. It just wasn't equal. I wasn't pushed down. I was simply never pulled forward. That's the kind of imbalance that doesn't bruise. It wears. It teaches you to expect less without realizing you're doing it. It teaches you to pay the bill quietly and slide the receipt into your bag before anyone notices. So when my mother said, "You owe this family," it didn't shock me the way it might have shocked someone else. It sounded familiar, like the last line of a speech I'd been hearing in pieces my entire life. What surprised her wasn't my silence. It was that, for once, I didn't move to fill it. I just sat there, steady as ever, thinking how strange it was that the person who'd needed me to be independent all these years suddenly decided I owed her for it. By then, the imbalance had settled into something quieter. Not anger, not resentment, just a kind of background hum, like an appliance you stop noticing until the power goes out. I didn't talk about it. I worked around it. After graduation, real life arrived without ceremony. No applause, no safety net. Just bills that showed up on time whether you were ready or not. I took a job as a data analysis assistant during the day, downtown, in an office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copy paper. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, the kind of place where ambition gets folded into spreadsheets and called growth. At night, I opened my laptop again. Freelance financial reports, balance sheets other people didn't want to look at, messy books from small firms trying to look bigger than they were. I liked the quiet of it. Numbers don't ask how you're holding up. They don't pretend. They either add up or they don't. Most nights, dinner happened around 10:30, sometimes later. Whatever I could pull together without thinking. Eggs, toast, something reheated until it lost its original purpose. I'd eat standing at the counter, scrolling through line items with one hand, fork in the other. The city outside my window would be winding down by then. Sirens farther apart, traffic thinning, Cleveland settling into itself. My family didn't know any of this. Not because I was hiding it exactly. It just never came up. When I visited, conversations stayed safely abstract. How's work? Busy. How's life? Fine. That word did a lot of heavy lifting. I paid off my student loans myself. $31,400 to be exact. I remember the number because I watched it tick down month by month, like a quiet countdown no one else was watching. I never asked for help. Not once. Not because I was proud, mostly because I knew the answer before the question finished forming. Some nights, I fell asleep with my laptop still open, screen dimmed but breathing softly, like it might wake me if something went wrong. I'd wake up around 3, disoriented, cheek pressed against the couch cushion, and close it gently, as if it had feelings. Then I'd crawl into bed without turning on the light. There was a strange comfort in being unseen. No expectations, no interruptions, just effort in exchange for stability. I built my life the way you build furniture without instructions. Slow, cautious, tightening each bolt twice because you can't afford to get it wrong. Looking back, I realize how much I was practicing for something I didn't yet know was coming. Reading fine print, watching dates, learning how systems work, and, more importantly, when they stop working for the people who rely on them blindly. While Ethan figured himself out, I figured out everything else. And the funny thing is, no one ever thanked me for being self-sufficient. They just came to expect it, like gravity, like rent due on the first, like me picking up the check and not making a show of it. So when my mother looked at me across that Thanksgiving table and said I owed this family, part of me almost admired the nerve. After all those years of quiet effort, of building something solid out of nothing but long nights and unpaid emotional labor, she finally said the part out loud she'd always assumed. I suppose that's what happens when people mistake your silence for consent. They forget you've been listening the whole time. Somewhere between those late nights and the quiet payoff of zero balances, something shifted. Not dramatically. No lightning bolt. Just a phone call that didn't sound urgent until it was. A former supervisor reached out about a startup based in the Midwest. Logistics, warehousing, distribution routes that had grown faster than their oversight. They needed someone to take a look. That phrase usually means trouble hiding behind spreadsheets. I said yes without thinking too hard about it. Habit, maybe. Or curiosity. Or the simple comfort of being useful in ways that didn't require explanation. The project started small. Remote access, shared folders, a few awkward video calls where everyone spoke a little too confidently about numbers they didn't fully understand. I listened more than I talked. I always do. Logistics has a way of exposing lies quietly. Costs don't drift for no reason. Shipping routes don't bleed money by accident. Somewhere, something was being counted wrong, or not counted at all. I found it on a Tuesday night, eating cold pasta straight from the container. A pattern that didn't line up. Fuel surcharges applied twice. Third-party carriers billing against outdated contracts. Individually, they looked like rounding errors. Together, they were hemorrhaging cash. I traced it back, line by line, the way you do when you don't trust the surface explanation. By midnight, I had a map of it laid out. By morning, the founders were silent on the call. They didn't argue. That's how I knew it mattered. Fixing it took weeks. Renegotiated terms, cleaned data, routes rerouted. Nothing flashy, just discipline. The kind that doesn't show up in pitch decks, but changes everything underneath. The company stabilized. Then it started to grow. The kind of growth that makes other people start asking questions. A year later, it was acquired. Quietly. No headlines, just paperwork and a handful of signatures that changed the direction of a few lives, mine included. They offered me a combination of equity and cash. Sensible numbers, structured, vesting schedules that rewarded patience instead of noise. I accepted without celebrating. I've never trusted money that arrives too loudly. It tends to leave the same way. I didn't suddenly become rich. There was no shopping spree, no announcement. I kept my apartment, kept my routines, upgraded a few practical things, health insurance that didn't require courage to use, a savings buffer thick enough to sleep through the night. The rest accumulated slowly, the way things do when you're not trying to impress anyone. I learned early that wealth doesn't announce itself. It settles. It organizes. It waits. And if you've spent enough years reading fine print and watching margins, you know the difference between what looks expensive and what actually costs something. I didn't tell my family. Not out of secrecy, just relevance. By then, my life had become something they didn't ask about in detail. Work was work. Life was fine. Those answers still fit. Looking back, that was the real pivot. Not the deal, not the money, but the moment I realized I had options. Real ones. The kind that don't require permission or approval or emotional negotiations disguised as concern. So when my mother spoke about sacrifice and obligation, when she framed my adulthood like an invoice overdue, she wasn't wrong about one thing. I had built something. Quietly. carefully, with more patience than anyone ever noticed. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't have known, is that I'd also learned when to stop paying into systems that no longer made sense. And once you learn that, really learn it, you don't argue, you wait. By the time I learned how to wait, I'd also learned how to look ordinary doing it. That part came naturally. When you grow up being the adjustable one, blending in becomes a skill you don't even realize you've mastered. To my family, nothing about me had changed. I still drove the same old Honda, the one with a faint rattle in the dashboard that only shows up on cold mornings. I liked it. It started every time. It didn't ask questions. I parked it wherever there was space and never worried about door dings. At holidays, I wore the same kind of sweaters I always had. Plain, soft, bought on sale because they lasted longer than trends. No logos, no signals. My mother noticed these things. She always has. She once looked me over, head tilted slightly, and said, "You should really aim higher at your age." Not cruelly, almost kindly, like advice passed down with a recipe. I nodded and took another sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm while she talked. What she didn't see was the other side of my life, the part that existed quietly, like a room in a house no one else had keys to. Accounts I checked once a month, never more. Numbers that had grown beyond what I used to imagine, then settled into something steady. My investment portfolio crossed 7.2 million sometime in the spring. I remember because the market was jittery that week, and the news anchors kept using words like uncertainty as if it were new. There was also the personal fund. Structured. Clean. My name on every document. No co-signers. No family entanglements. I set it up the same way I do everything else. Carefully. With an exit in mind, even if I never planned to use it. None of it felt secretive. It felt private. There's a difference. Secrets are heavy. Privacy is light enough to carry without changing how you walk. I still brought the same side dishes to family dinners, still offered to help clean up, still picked up checks when we went out, sliding my card across the table before anyone could argue. They took that as confirmation of what they already believed, that I was comfortable, maybe, but not successful. Stable, but not impressive. The dependable middle ground where people feel free to make suggestions. And honestly, I let them. There's a strange freedom in being underestimated. Expectations stay low. Hands stay off your business. No one digs where they assume there's nothing buried. Sometimes, sitting across from my mother as she talked about Ethan's latest plan or disappointment or reinvention, I'd catch myself almost smiling. Not out of spite, just recognition. She spoke with such confidence about where everyone stood, what everyone needed, who was doing well enough. It was like watching someone give directions using an old map, completely unaware the roads had shifted years ago. If I'd told her the truth, she would have panicked, asked questions, made plans that involved me without asking. Money, in my family, has always been a group project the moment someone else discovers it exists. So I kept my life divided cleanly down the middle, the version they saw, and the version that paid attention to dates, documents, and leverage. One for Sunday dinners, one for everything that mattered. That double life didn't feel dishonest. It felt protective, like wearing gloves to handle something delicate. Which is why, when my mother finally decided to name the debt she believed I owed, she assumed I'd panic or protest or explain myself. She didn't realize I'd been living with two realities for years, and that the one she thought she understood was the smaller one. By the time my life split cleanly into what was seen and what was real, helping quietly felt like the only language that still made sense. Not generosity as a performance, just maintenance. The kind you do without announcing it, the way you replace a loose step before someone trips. My mother's credit card debt had been creeping up for years. I could hear it in the way she talked about bills, always vaguely, always with a tight smile. Nothing dramatic, just phrases like, "things add up," and "we're managing." One evening, after a casual complaint about interest rates, I went home and made a few calls. Numbers again. Due dates. Fine print. I set it up so $5,800 moved each month, automatically, quietly. No note, no explanation, just relief arriving on time. The payment showed up as an adjustment, a restructuring, something that looked technical enough to discourage curiosity. A few weeks later, she mentioned it in passing, almost confused, said something about a program she must have qualified for. Funny how things work out sometimes, she said, stirring her coffee. I agreed. Ethan's graduate school was trickier. He talked about it constantly, always on the edge of starting, always needing just one more push. When the tuition notice came, heavy with zeros and optimism, I routed it through a support fund I'd set up years earlier. Clean structure, third-party administration, the kind of thing that reads like opportunity instead of charity. He called me, excited, breathless, said he couldn't believe his luck. Someone out there really believes in me, he said. I told him that was great. I meant it. No one asks questions. People rarely do when help arrives without strings. It's easier to believe in luck than intention. Easier to thank the universe than reconsider the way a family functions. I didn't correct them. Not when my mother sighed with relief about her finances. Not when Ethan talked about fresh starts and destiny and timing. Correction would have changed the shape of things. It would have turned help into leverage, and I wasn't interested in that kind of power. I'd had enough of it used on me. There was something almost peaceful about watching stability settle in around them, knowing I'd had a hand in it without leaving fingerprints. Like fixing a leak behind the walls. The house stays dry. No one needs to know why. If I'm honest, part of me wanted to see how things would play out if money stopped being the excuse. If debt lifted and opportunities arrived and the pressure eased, would anything else change? Would gratitude replace expectation? Would balance follow relief? It didn't, not really. The tone stayed the same. The advice, the assumptions, the casual way my contributions were folded into the background, reclassified as circumstances instead of choices. When my mother talked about sacrifice, she still meant hers. When Ethan talked about support, he still meant abstract forces aligning in his favor. And I let it stand. Because the help wasn't about recognition, it was about control. Mine. I learned that the most effective way to give in my family was invisibly. Anything else came with commentary, conditions, and a revised narrative where my role shifted back to debtor instead of provider. So when my mother said, "You owe this family," she wasn't lying in her own mind. She simply didn't have all the information. She was still working from the version of me that drove an old Honda and wore plain sweaters and aimed too low. She didn't know she'd been sleeping easier for months because someone else had decided she should. She didn't know her son's second chance came with a fund that didn't ask for applause. And she didn't know I was listening carefully, weighing not whether to help, but whether it was finally time to stop helping without being asked. Sometimes silence isn't kindness. Sometimes it's a test. By the time Thanksgiving came around again, the test had already begun. I just didn't know it yet. That year, I hired a catering service. Not because I couldn't cook, but because I didn't want the evening to turn into a referendum on effort. The kind of place that arrives quietly, sets everything up without needing supervision, and leaves behind food that tastes like someone else worried about it for you. I told my mother it was a convenience. She nodded, suspicious but pleased. Comfort, when outsourced, always looks like indulgence to her. I brought my laptop with me, set it on the sideboard near the coats, half visible, like a prop I could point to if anyone asked why I stepped away. Deadline, I said when my aunt raised an eyebrow. That word still works on people. It sounds responsible enough to avoid follow-up questions. The house smelled expensive that afternoon. Butter, herbs, something citrusy I couldn't name. Plates were warmed, candles lit, everything arranged to suggest abundance without ever admitting where it came from. I noticed the details the way I always do. The way the napkins matched the runner, the way the wine had been decanted early, like someone wanted to impress without being accused of trying. We sat, we passed dishes, we talked around things. Ethan was relaxed, buoyed by the kind of confidence that comes from believing the world is finally catching up to you. My mother watched him with that familiar mix of pride and relief, as if his stability reflected directly on her. She glanced at me now and then, assessing, measuring. I felt it the way you feel a draft in a room that's otherwise warm. Halfway through the meal, after compliments had been exchanged and seconds offered, she leaned back slightly and looked at me over the rim of her glass. "If you're doing this well," she said, gesturing vaguely at the table, the food, the effort she assumed I hadn't put in myself, "it's time you give back properly." The word properly settled between us. Heavy, specific. An upgrade from the vague obligation she'd always implied. This wasn't about groceries or help anymore. This was a claim. No one spoke right away. The caterer's work did its job. The food kept everyone occupied just long enough for the sentence to land without interruption. I felt the familiar pull, the old reflex to clarify, to soften, to explain what she didn't know. I didn't. I took a sip of water, reached for my napkin, folded it once, then again. Small movements, controlled. I could feel her watching, waiting for me to fill the space she'd created. She always did. Instead, I slid my phone out and checked the calendar. Same date as before, same quiet certainty. Nothing had changed since the last time I'd looked, except the fact that she'd finally said the quiet part out loud. I put the phone face down on the table. "I'm listening," I said evenly. She straightened, encouraged, began outlining what she meant by giving back. Not numbers, not specifics, just expectations dressed up as values. Family helping family. Fairness. All the words that sound noble until you ask who decides what they cost. I nodded where appropriate. Didn't interrupt. Didn't commit. Around us, the conversation resumed in fragments, everyone pretending not to notice the shift while tracking it closely. That's how families do tension. Collectively, but never directly. What struck me wasn't the demand itself. It was the timing, the confidence, the assumption that my success, whatever shape she imagined it took, automatically belonged to her jurisdiction. That whatever I'd built quietly was now subject to review. She finished speaking and waited. I smiled, small and polite, and said I'd think about it. Later, while plates were cleared and leftovers packed into containers no one would label correctly, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere between dusk and dark, a decision settled in me. Not emotional, not angry, just clear. She thought Thanksgiving was the moment she applied pressure. She didn't realize it was the moment I stopped absorbing it. The house emptied slowly after that. Leftovers stacked, coats claimed, thank you hugs exchanged with the careful warmth people use when they sense something unresolved but don't want to touch it. I stayed a little longer than usual, mostly because it was easier than explaining why I didn't feel like driving just yet. Ethan asked if he could use my room to make a quick call. His phone was dying, he said. I told him sure. He'd always treated my space like neutral territory, familiar but not important. I went back to the kitchen to rinse a glass, listening to the faucet run longer than necessary, giving him privacy I didn't know I was about to lose. A minute passed, then another. When he called my name, it wasn't casual. It wasn't panicked either, just altered, like someone who stepped into cold water without expecting it. I walked down the hall. The door to my room was open. My laptop sat on the desk where I'd left it, screen awake. Ethan stood in front of it, hands at his sides, staring as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. I followed his gaze. The investment dashboard was still open. I must have closed it halfway earlier and never finished the job. There it was, plain and unembellished. $12,180,000. No commas misplaced, no tricks of lighting, just a number sitting quietly where it had no business being seen. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He didn't touch the keyboard, didn't point, didn't ask if it was real. He just stood there, breathing shallow, eyes flicking once to me and back to the screen, like he needed both in the same frame to believe it. My mother appeared behind me in the doorway, drawn by the silence. She took one look at Ethan's face, then at the laptop. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. She stepped into the room without a word, as if sound might shatter something. 20 seconds passed. I know because I counted. It's a habit. You learn to measure silence when you grow up inside it. No one accused me of lying. No one laughed. No one asked how. The room absorbed the information the way a body absorbs a shock. Slowly, unevenly, prioritizing survival over curiosity. Finally, my mother spoke, or tried to. What came out was my name, thin and unfamiliar in her mouth, like she was tasting it for the first time. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't close the laptop. I didn't justify anything. I just watched them recalibrate in real time, the old map tearing itself apart behind their eyes. Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed without asking. He looked younger suddenly, not broken, just smaller. My mother gripped the back of the chair, knuckles pale, as if the furniture might drift away without her. "That's a lot," she said eventually. "It is," I agreed. Another stretch of quiet followed, different this time, heavier. This wasn't the silence of omission. This was the silence of correction. She looked at me then, not assessing, not measuring, but searching, trying to find the version of me she'd been speaking to at the table an hour earlier. The one who needed advice. The one who owed. "I didn't know," she said. "I know," I replied. That was the moment it shifted. Not when the number appeared, but when she realized how long it must have existed without her knowledge. How much time had passed while she'd been offering guidance to someone who'd already outgrown it. No one apologized. No one asked forgiveness. Those come later, if they come at all. What settled instead was something quieter. Recognition. Not respect. Not yet. Just awareness. I closed the laptop gently, the way you do when you're done proving a point you never intended to make. 20 seconds had been enough. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a speech. It just needs the room to go quiet long enough for everyone to hear it. The silence didn't last. It never does. Silence in my family is just the inhale before entitlement exhales. My mother was the first to recover. She straightened her shoulders, the way she does when she decides which version of herself she's going to use. Concern came first, then confusion. Then something sharper slipped in underneath. "So you let us struggle?" she said. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The sentence landed with the quiet confidence of an accusation she'd already decided was true. Struggle, in her vocabulary, has always meant discomfort without context. It doesn't account for help received quietly. It doesn't register relief that arrives without credit. I watched her as she spoke. Watched the way her eyes flicked, already recalculating the past with this new information inserted retroactively. Every memory rearranging itself around a number she'd just learned to pronounce. Ethan didn't wait long. He never does when momentum shifts in his favor. "I only need a couple million to get started," he said, like he was asking for jumper cables. Not greedy, practical, reasonable. He spoke fast, ideas stacking on top of each other. Business plans that sounded familiar in shape, but light on gravity. confidence borrowed from proximity. I nodded once, slowly, the way you do when you're making sure you heard something correctly. It struck me then, not painfully, just clearly, that no one had asked the obvious question. Not one of them had said, "Are you okay?" Or, "How did you manage that?" Or even, "Was it hard?" They jumped straight to allocation. That's when I understood the real cost of being invisible for so long. You don't get sympathy when you finally step into the light. You get audited. My mother paced the room, talking now, piecing together a narrative where my success created their hardship, where my silence was a withholding, where help, once anonymous, became insufficient the moment it wasn't named. Ethan sat forward, elbows on his knees, already negotiating in his head. Percentages, timelines, roles he imagined himself stepping into with my resources as the starting point. I stayed where I was. I felt oddly calm, not detached, just finished. Like I'd reached the end of a long conversation I'd been having with myself for years, and this was the part where I finally stopped responding. "I didn't let anyone struggle," I said eventually. My voice sounded steady to my own ears. "I helped the way I chose to." "That's not the same," my mother said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." What I didn't say was that the difference mattered. That help given quietly preserves dignity. That help demanded becomes ownership. I didn't say it because they wouldn't have heard it. They were already too busy converting my life into numbers they felt entitled to influence. Ethan leaned back, frustration creeping in. "You could change everything for us," he said. I looked at him then. Really looked. The eagerness, the assumption, the complete absence of curiosity about what it had taken to get here. He wasn't malicious, just practiced. "I already did," I said. That stopped him. My mother went quiet again, her mouth tightening, the room recalibrating around this version of reality she hadn't prepared for. For the first time all night, she looked uncertain. Not scared, just unarmed. Still, no one asked how I was. Not after years of late nights. Not after carrying 2 lives at once. Not even now. And that was the answer, really. Greed doesn't always look like grabbing. Sometimes it looks like skipping the question that would humanize the person you're about to ask something from. I stood up, smoothed my sweater, and picked up my phone. The date was still there, and suddenly, everything made sense. I didn't make the decision that night. I'd already made it weeks earlier, maybe months. That evening just gave it a timestamp. I drove home in silence, the kind that doesn't ask for music. The highway was nearly empty. Ohio stretched out and flat and familiar, like a place you know well enough to leave without nostalgia. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I set my keys down, took off my coat, and stood there long enough to feel the room settle around me. It felt different, lighter, as if something invisible had finally let go. The next morning, I made coffee and opened my laptop. No ceremony, no dramatic pauses. I stopped the transfers first. The monthly payment, the tuition routing, all of it. A few clicks. Confirmations stacked neatly in my inbox, each one calm and final. Systems are good that way. They don't argue. They just do what you tell them. Then I blocked contact. 90 days. Not forever. Just enough time to hear my own thoughts again, without them being edited by obligation. Enough time for the dust to settle where it wanted to, instead of where it was always pushed. I sent one message before I did. Help was a choice, not a debt. I didn't explain further. Explanation invites negotiation, and I was done negotiating the meaning of my life. There were calls, of course. Voicemails that shifted in tone from disbelief to accusation to something like panic. Messages from Ethan that tried to sound reasonable, then wounded, then indignant. I didn't listen to them. I archived them. Silence isn't avoidance when it's intentional. It's maintenance. 2 weeks later, I signed a lease in another state. Not far enough to make a point, just far enough to breathe differently. The apartment was smaller, but brighter, with a window that caught the afternoon sun and a kitchen that didn't echo. I liked that. It felt honest. On moving day, I packed lightly. You'd be surprised how little you actually need when you stop carrying other people's expectations around with you. I closed the door behind me without looking back. No speech, no final glance, just the click of the lock and the certainty that followed. That first night, I ordered takeout from a place down the street. Nothing fancy, ate at the counter, barefoot, listening to the low hum of a building settling into evening. No phone lighting up, no calendar reminders tugging at me, just food, quiet, and the strange realization that peace doesn't announce itself. It arrives the same way everything else important in my life always had, without applause. I thought about my mother, about Ethan, about how quickly love can turn transactional when people realize they misjudge the balance of power. I didn't feel angry. I felt done. There's a difference. For years, I'd believed distance was something that happened to families when things went wrong. I understand now that sometimes it's what happens when things finally go right. That night, I washed my plate, dried it, and put it away. I sat down with a book I didn't finish and turned off the light when I felt like it. No one needed anything from me. No one was keeping score. For the first time in my adult life, dinner was quiet. And it stayed that way.